From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peggy Pearlstein. I'm head of the Hebraic section here in the African Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's program with author Ellen Cassedy, who will be speaking about her book, We Are Here, Memories of the Lithuanian Holocaust. Our program today is co-sponsored with the European Division of the Library of Congress, and I'm going to ask my colleague, Regina Frakowiak, to come up and say a few words.
Well, on behalf of the European Division, welcome and thank you for coming. The European Division, with its beautiful, much smaller reading room, is located on the same floor, just across the Great Hall. So if you have a minute, please come visit us. It's a beautiful reading room. I am responsible for Lithuania in my division, and the division is responsible for providing reference and for developing collections relating to continental Europe, except for Iberia. That is taken care of by the Hispanic reading room just next to us. Actually, you have to come through the Hispanic reading room to access the European reading room. I would like to welcome the author today, and it's exciting to have you here and listening about your book. Thank you.
A couple of announcements first. Next Tuesday, we have a program which is here, and the author Susan McGee will be talking about this artist from the Holocaust and how he moved from darkness to light. So please join us next Tuesday, same time, same place. And then the week after that, on Tuesday, December 11th, we will have a public celebration of a book that was just edited here at the library, a series of lectures, Perspectives on the Hebraic Book. Tuesday, same time, different place. It will be in the Mary Pickford Theater. And if you would like to be on our mailing list, please let me know after the program or my colleague, Dr. Ann Brenner. And finally, Regina invited you to come to the European Reading Room, but I also invite you after the program, if you haven't been to see our exhibit already, which is right behind you on the other side of the Great Hall. It's called Words Like Sapphires, 100 Years of Hebraica at the Library of Congress, 1912 to 2012. So it'll be up till the middle of March. Make sure you get to see it. Ellen Cassedy's articles, essays, and translations have appeared in Hadassah, The Forward, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and other publications. She's a former columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News and worked as a speechwriter in the Clinton administration. She's been awarded the 2012 Translation Prize by the National Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, with her colleague, and actually with my colleague, Aaron Taub, who is head of the Israel Judaica section, and Aaron is sitting right there with glasses, and the two of them were awarded a $2,500 translation prize, developing, and the prize is to develop a new generation of Yiddish translators. In addition, Ellen's book has just won the Prakim International Literary Foundation Prize, awarded annually on Holocaust Remembrance Day. Over the past 10 years, Ellen Cassedy's been engaged in a fascinating journey into Lithuania, past and present. Her book, We Are Here, Memories of the Lithuanian Holocaust, has just been published by the University of Nebraska Press, and it will be available for purchase after the lecture, and the woman who's handling it is sitting back there in a red sweater. So one more thing I'd like to tell you before we hear from Ellen. This event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period. But please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you're consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, Ellen Cassedy.
Okay. Technical matters.
There you go.
Great, okay. Thank you so much, and thank all of you for coming very much. It's really an honor for me to speak here at the library, one of our nation's true cultural treasures, and a place that's been very important to me in my research, and also, of course, the home of my beloved colleague, Aaron. So let's get started here. I went to Lithuania looking for answers about my own Jewish past. But very quickly, I found myself pulled into a larger exploration of how a young post-Holocaust, post-Soviet society is engaging with its Jewish family past. And over the past 10 years, this exploration has taken over my life. It's changed my view of the past, it's changed my view of the future, and it's changed me. Not only because I care deeply about the land of my own Jewish forebears, but also because Lithuania's struggle to come to terms with its Jewish past has implications far beyond Lithuania itself. The questions raised here in this small European country matter for other European countries, for Bosnia, for Russia, for South Africa and Rwanda. And they matter for all of us who care about how a country burdened by conflict and scarred by genocide can honor its past and move forward into the future. Is that even possible? So I want to begin by telling you what drew me into this investigation myself, then I'll share some of my findings and conclusions, and then we'll have some time for discussion, and we'll be done by 1 o'clock. Okay. My grandfather, the one on the left, the cute one, came to America from Lithuania in 1911 at the age of 19, escaping from the Tsarist draft. And this is my Jewish grandfather on my mother's side. The other side has to do with England, Germany, and Ireland, which is where the name Cassedy comes from, in case you were wondering. Where the red hair or the previously red hair comes from is a matter of debate. When my mother was alive, I could count on her to keep track of my grandfather and all those who had come before. But when she died, I felt my family past beginning to slip away, to disappear. And my mother had used Yiddish, the Jewish language, only sparingly, like a spice. But when she died, I missed Yiddish. And when I found out there was an institute in Yiddish in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, I was eager to go. Now, mind you, at that point, I barely knew where Lithuania was. I had to get out an atlas to learn that it's the most southern of the 3 Baltic republics, with Latvia and Estonia on top. A republic of the Soviet Union from the end of World War II until 1991. Geographically, it's about 1.5 times the size of Virginia, and the population is less than 3.5 million, which is less than half of Virginia, so it's a tiny place. But one thing I did know, and had always known, was that Lithuania had a notorious Holocaust history. I knew that in 1941, when the German army invaded, the Jews of Lithuania were massacred with a swiftness and brutality that was unusual even for that terrible time. I knew that it was the German invaders who actually issued the orders, but it was members of the Lithuanian white bands who pulled the trigger. I knew that the surrounding population did not speak up to stop the slaughter, and that many Lithuanians lent a hand to the persecution of their Jewish neighbors. I knew that hundreds of Lithuanian towns have their pit in the forest not far from the market square, where Jews were assembled, shot, and hastily buried in mass graves. And I knew that during the war, in the 3 major Lithuanian cities, tens of thousands of Lithuanian Jews were confined in ghettos. By the end of the war, only 6% of Lithuania's 240,000 Jews were left alive. One of them was my Uncle Will, the one on the left, the cute one. So before leaving for the Vilnius Yiddish Institute, I went to New York to see Uncle Will, and I brought some street maps that I had downloaded from the internet. My uncle was 87 years old, and 60 years had passed since he left Europe, but he could still put his finger on exactly where he lived and where he went to school. But then my uncle did something that profoundly changed my journey to Lithuania. He took me aside and confided for the first time that while he was confined in the ghetto in the Lithuanian city of Šavel or Šiauliai, he'd been a member of the Jewish ghetto police. I'd known my uncle all my life, and all my life I had treasured heroic images of him in the Holocaust. I knew that he had saved 2 little girls during a roundup in the ghetto. I knew that he had saved my Uncle Aaron on a death march out of Dachau. But this, being a member of the Jewish police, this I had never heard. Now, as many of you know, in ghettos all across Europe, the Nazi command would require the Jews of the ghetto to create an internal police force with the job of carrying out Nazi orders. So when Jewish workers were needed to build an airfield or manufacture weapons, it was the Jewish police who would gather them, assemble them, put them in straight lines, and march them off to work. And when the authorities demanded 50 or 100 or even 1,000 victims to be marched to the killing fields, in some ghettos, it was the Jewish police who played a role in deciding who would live and who would die. But the Jewish police helped the ghetto inmates also by allocating food and housing. They saved people's lives by subverting Nazi orders, warning people, helping people to escape. So the Jewish ghetto police were controversial back then among the inhabitants of the ghetto, and they have remained controversial ever since. Primo Levi, the eloquent survivor of Auschwitz, called them inhabitants of a gray zone where good and evil blur. And as Uncle Will revealed this new information from his past, the picture of the Holocaust that I had grown up with began to break apart for me. I could feel myself becoming agitated and ashamed. What had my uncle done in the ghetto? And what was I to do with his disclosure? Should I defend him, condemn him, forgive him? So that was the first thing that happened that radically changed my journey to the land of my ancestors. The second thing was that I heard back from an official in Rokiškis, the small town or shtetl where my ancestors had lived for generations. She wrote that there was an old Gentile man in town named Stepanas who wanted to talk to me. In 1941, as a boy of 17, Stepanas had watched as the Jews of Rokiškis were assembled in a field and driven into the forest to be shot. And that knowledge had tormented him all his life, the town official wrote to me. He wanted to tell what he knew. He wanted to speak to a Jew before he died. And would I be that Jew? Now, I have to say I was not eager to be that Jew. And if not what I had heard from my uncle, I think I might have said no. I might have turned away. But now the ground had shifted, and so I agreed. Yes, I would be that Jew. And so I went off to Lithuania. Wait a minute. And in the mornings at the Yiddish Institute, we studied Yiddish language and literature in all its glory, which was a machaya. Now, does anybody know what a machaya is? Yes? Delight, a pleasure. I've heard the word machaya described as what happened when Jewish women from Brooklyn on a broiling hot day would make their way to the beach and finally get into the water, splash water on themselves. Ah, a machaya, a machaya. So in the afternoons, the last Yiddish speakers of Vilna, who are now in their 80s, walked us through the streets of this beautiful city, once known as Yerushalayim Delita, the Jerusalem of the North, now home to only 2,000 Jews. We saw the Church of St. Casimir. Now, during the Soviet era, this church was turned into a mocking museum of atheism, where both Jewish and Catholic relics were put on display for people to laugh at. What were they thinking? We saw the empty lot where the great synagogue once stood. It was bombed by the Nazis and after the war bulldozed by the Soviets. We saw plaques about the Holocaust and about pre-war Jewish culture in Lithuanian and Yiddish. And in the Tolerance Center, which is part of the Jewish Museum, we saw Jewish artifacts that had been saved all during the Soviet era by Lithuanian curators, hidden away in back rooms of museum warehouses, by people who were determined to preserve the Jewish past, and now they are proudly on display. We went to Friday night services at the one remaining synagogue, which was embroiled in a controversy between two warring factions of the Jewish community, one ultra-Orthodox, led by a Chabad rabbi from Brooklyn, and the other more Russian-identified, and security guards were keeping the peace. And we began to make our way into the complexities of history in this part of the world. We learned that for centuries, Jews and non-Jews lived side by side in Lithuania relatively peaceably, unlike in other places, Ukraine and Poland. Pogroms were rare. On the brink of World War II, Jews made up about 1/3 of the population of Lithuanian cities and about half of the population of Lithuanian towns and villages. But relations between the Jewish and non-Jewish, overwhelmingly Catholic culture were never particularly warm. Jews were others, and that helped to lay the groundwork for what happened next. In 1940, Soviet tanks arrived, rolling into Lithuania in what turned out to be a futile attempt to prevent a German invasion. In 1941, just weeks before the German army did invade, the Soviets arrested thousands of Lithuanians and Jews and deported them to Siberia. In a way reminiscent of the Nazi era, a knock on the door in the middle of the night, 10 minutes to pack, the whole family ordered out into the street, into a truck, into a boxcar, a journey into the unknown. Many people died on the way there, and many more died when they got there. Then in June of 41, the German tanks did roll in, and a multicultural place became a place of mass murder. Nor did the end of World War II bring peace to Lithuania. The three Baltic nations were incorporated into the Soviet Union, and it was not an easy transition. A bloody resistance struggle went on for 7 years in Lithuania, and the deportations began again. This time, tens of thousands of Lithuanians and a few remaining Jews, including one of my uncles, were arrested and sent to Siberia. Between 1940 and 1952, historians say that as much as 1/3 of the Lithuanian population was lost to massacres, war casualties, deportations, executions, and emigration. And by the time the Soviet Union fell in 1991 and Lithuania became a new independent nation, half a century under two occupation regimes had created a cauldron, boiling and bubbling with competing martyrdoms, competing feelings of victimhood, seemingly irreconcilable narratives about the past, stereotypes, resentments, and hatreds. Investigating that cauldron became the heart of my stay in Lithuania and the heart of my book. So to give you a sense of how challenging the situation is, one blustery day, I visited a place called Tuskulėnai, an old estate in the heart of Vilnius. In 1994, hundreds of bodies were discovered under the lawn of this estate, and forensic analysis showed that they were the bodies of people who had been executed by Soviet authorities right after World War II. So here it was, shortly after independence in 1991, and the Lithuanian public was hungry to grieve over its mistreatment at the hands of the Soviets and to commemorate the fallen. So planning began for a memorial at the site, a monument that would honor Lithuania's suffering and resistance to Stalinist oppression. But then a painful truth emerged. It turned out that many of the bodies, hundreds of them, were those of Nazi collaborators who had helped to massacre Jews in 1941, and that's why they had been executed. So to their credit, construction of the memorial came to a halt, and a fierce debate began over what to do with the bodies and the site. Now, most often in Lithuania, history is served up in pieces. On one side of town, you have the Jewish Museum telling the history of the Holocaust. On the other side of town, an entirely separate institution called the Museum of Genocide Victims tells not about the history of the Jews, but about the suffering of Lithuanians under the Soviets before and after World War II. At Tusculene, it was not possible to separate the bones into two neat piles, patriots over here, murderers over there. And so when the site finally did open in 2004, it was officially not a monument and not a shrine. Instead, it was designated as a place to reflect on complex truths, with the eerie name of the Park of Quiet. Now you see that it has an unmistakably Christian feel. And from what I've heard, the site is threatening to tip, or has already tipped, into being a memorial to only one history rather than to the full complexity. It has not really fulfilled its stated mission to become a place to reflect on complex truths. And given how complex those truths are, perhaps that's not surprising. As I walked around Tusculene, I must say I felt overwhelmed by the complexities of facing the past in the land of my ancestors. But now let me introduce you very briefly to some of the people who helped me see a way forward from these complexities. Brave souls, Jews and non-Jews, who were working in an often hostile environment to create a new public discourse, to bring the Holocaust out of the open, to reach across radically divergent views of history, to search for a path toward mutual understanding in an effort to build a better future. These people surprised me, they educated me, and they inspired me. They gave me hope for Lithuania, for other lands seeking to move forward from conflict, for all of us. This is Irena Vesaita, a remarkable woman, a Jewish woman, a tolerance leader. At the age of 15, Irena went into the Kovno ghetto alone without either her mother or her father. After more than 2 years, non-Jewish Lithuanians managed to smuggle her out, and she ended up hiding in the home of the widow of a World War I Lithuanian general, a woman she came to consider her second mother. And this is how Irena survived. But after the war, this second mother was sent to Siberia by the Soviet regime. So Irena's whole family was killed by the Nazis, and then her second mother was taken from her. Yet out of this terrible suffering, she emerged as a leader of efforts toward mutual understanding. And she defines tolerance as a permissive or liberal attitude toward beliefs or practices different from or conflicting with one's own. But she adds another concept to that definition, the non-acceptance of intolerance. The intolerance of intolerance. Not easy concepts. As I stepped through new doorways in Lithuania, Irena was my guide. A second snapshot, these two Gentile women were employed by the Lithuanian government to design curricula about the Holocaust for Lithuanians of all ages. They believed passionately that if Lithuania is to mature as a nation, Lithuanians must ask themselves rigorous moral questions about the Holocaust. Now, I often heard Lithuanians say that 1/3 of their countrymen had killed Jews, 1% had saved Jews, the other 98% were bystanders, and so if you add it all up, the score is even, neutral. And I found that calculation quite offensive. So I asked these women, how should we judge? How should we judge the bystanders? How should we judge this man, Stepanas, waiting to talk to me in Rokiškės? And I was very struck by their answer. They said, our mission is to ask this question, not to answer it. It is not for the Jews that we were doing this. It is not for international relations. This is for us. Our goal, they said, is to transform ourselves from a society of bystanders, and worse, into an active civil society. This billboard says, who, if not you, will determine the future of Lithuania? Become socially active. Now, the agency where these women work has a big name, the International Commission for the Evaluation of the Crimes of the Nazi and Soviet occupation regimes. And it has a big mission, too big, some say. Critics worry that lumping the Nazi and Soviet eras together under one roof lends credence to the idea that Lithuanian suffering under the Soviets was fully equal to Jewish suffering under the Nazis, the so-called double genocide theory, or red equals brown. But these women told me that they believe that the dual structure with the Nazi and Soviet periods under one roof makes sense. They say that to shape their future, Lithuanians need to examine what happened in both eras. And unless people feel that their own grievances are being fully heard, they can find it difficult to attend to the grievances of others. So bringing non-Jewish suffering to the table alongside the Jewish tragedy without weighing the two, can help to open minds and hearts. It can help people say not yes but yes and. Yes, you have grievances, you were wronged, and I too have grievances, I suffered. And that, it is hoped, can create a compassionate, open frame of mind rather than a closed, competitive frame of mind. But it's a difficult balance. In fact, for several years, one half of the commission, the Holocaust half, was shut down because of a damaging controversy that ballooned into an international incident. And this had to do with the fact that the Lithuanian prosecutor's office was dragging its feet over bringing to trial elderly Nazi collaborators, but instead chose to point the finger at several elderly Jews who had been anti-Nazi partisans, accusing them of war crimes over the killing of civilians during the partisan skirmishes. Two of these accused former anti-Nazi partisans are the very women who led us Yiddish students through the streets of the old Jewish quarter. But just recently, I hear that an agreement has been reached and the commission is fully back in business with the full participation of Yad Vashem, the American Jewish Committee, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. The third and final snapshot, I talked with Ruta Pushita, a young Gentile woman who was directing a traveling exhibit for the Jewish Museum. And her job was to get in a truck and drive to tiny Lithuanian towns and villages where she would set up a series of panels about 7 centuries of Jewish history, actual, standing panels that people could walk through. She told me that the word Holocaust was new to many of the local people, and most of them had never met a Jew. And she showed me the text of the booklet she was writing, and here are the questions she was posing. What do you think of Albert Einstein saying, "The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing"? Have you ever been in a situation where someone needed your help and you didn't provide it? If so, why did you behave like others rather than following your own conscience? Is there a connection between your answers and the behavior of people during the war? So these are the kinds of questions that Lithuanians are being asked to grapple with. And they're tough questions, searing questions. Finally, and this is the last experience I'm going to describe, my guide and I drove to the very northeast corner of Lithuania, the heartland of my family past, to Rokiškės, where my family tree extends back into the mid-1800s. There, I breathed in the summer light of the vast Baltic sky. I saw the ochre-colored wooden houses and the marigolds spilling out into the yards, and the road that is still called Synagogue Street, where my great-grandfather used to pore over the Talmud. And then came the moment that I must admit I was dreading, the visit with the old man who wanted to speak to a Jew before he died. Let me read you a little bit from the book. We pulled up in front of a cottage with a steep tin roof. Stepanus came out, bent and gnarled, with a stick, his face deeply lined and weathered, his wife in a house dress, several silver teeth. He didn't look at me. They got into the car, the old man in front with the driver, the woman in back with my guide and me. He asked the driver to drive slowly through the town. Here, to the right of this flower bed, he said, was the camp. The Jews were driven here. They were told that if they did not give up their valuables, they would be drowned in the pond. After they gave up their valuables, they were driven over this bridge into this field. All of these houses and barns were full of Jews. I drove my wagon, he said, loaded with carrots past the camp. I threw carrots over the fence. The guards threatened to kill me. The Jews were driven down the road. The white armband police lined both sides of the road. These were the Lithuanians who collaborated with the Nazis. The white armbands, he said, came from the villages and small towns all over this region. You needed a lot of people to guard such a huge crowd of Jews, thousands of Jews. Stepanus began to weep. They took all the people marching, he said, even children and old people. It was all on my eyes, he said. I was watching. We got out of the car, and I went into his cottage, the wood stove up to the ceiling, the plaster walls painted bright green. I touched the battered pots, the cucumbers on the table, and finally we did look at each other. Oops. He tapped his chest and looked into my eyes. It was terrible, he said, and I nodded and I shook his hand. So what do we make of all this? I'll tell you some of what I concluded, though for the full story and the full unspooling of the story about my Uncle Will, you'll have to, of course, read the book. I went to Lithuania wanting to learn Yiddish, wanting to imagine myself back into the lives of my ancestors, and wanting to make up my mind about my uncle and about Stepanas, the bystander. I wanted to judge once and for all. But my visit to the old world changed me. When I met Stepanas and other Lithuanians who were engaging so painfully with the past, I lost the urge to sift and to sort and to make neat columns. I don't want to make too much of my encounter with Stepanas. I didn't spend much time with him, I don't know him, and whoever he is and whatever he said, in no way does he erase the wrongdoing of those who stood passively by, and certainly the wrongdoing of those who actually committed those acts. But in listening to this sobbing man, I did come to appreciate that the term bystander encompasses a very wide range of behaviors, and that it can be hard to judge, hard to condemn, especially when we ask ourselves how we might have acted under similar conditions of terror. Stepanas was not only a bystander. At times he did more than simply stand and watch. By throwing carrots over the fence into the ghetto, he risked his own safety, his own life. And the experience of watching while others were assembled to be murdered had clearly inflicted a deep wound that he had never recovered from. Uncle Will, the policeman, was clearly a victim, but also, if not a collaborator, also some kind of bystander. With his policeman's armband, he stood by, feeling powerless to resist as children and old people were loaded into trucks and driven away into the unknown. As Primo Levi says of the Jewish prisoners who became part of the death machine at Auschwitz, at the crematoriums, he said, "I ask that we meditate on their story with pity and rigor, but the judgment of them be suspended. The guilt," Levi tells us, "lies in the system itself. As for the guilt of such individuals, this," he says, "is always difficult to evaluate. I know of no human tribunal to which one could delegate the judgment." So as I meditated and continue to meditate on the stories of the two old men, my Uncle Will and Stepanas, the bystander, I have come to understand that in this moral terrain, the journey itself matters very much, the serious attention we pay. I don't think I will ever stop wondering about Uncle Will's actions in the ghetto. I will never stop pondering Stepanas's role in the genocide that killed my people. To ask without ever expecting to be done with the asking, that is the work of a lifetime. The attempt we make to listen and to understand, this, I came to feel, is where the hope lies for Lithuania, for Eastern Europe, for other countries struggling to emerge from conflict, and for all of us. So during that terrible time in the mid-20th century, solidarity was often difficult, if not impossible. In that time, as in so many other times, it was so much easier to stand by than to stand up. And our job as human beings and as citizens, I think, is to reverse that equation, to create the kind of society where you can stand up, where it's not up to each person individually to make the terrible life and death decisions, to decide whether to put your head up and risk getting it blown off or risk getting your children's heads blown off. And it is not easy to open up to the other. I didn't find it easy. It can be tempting, as the historian Timothy Snyder, who we were talking about before, as Snyder said, he's the author of the new book, Bloodlands, which I highly recommend. It's tempting, he said, to say that my memory is history and your memory is propaganda. My memory is sacred, your memory is bigotry. My people are good, your people are evil. Anti-Semitism is alive and well in Lithuania today. I saw swastikas. Right-wing nationalists are present and influential in Lithuanian politics, and there's plenty to criticize about the actions and inactions of the Lithuanian government. The government has done a poor job of bringing former Nazi collaborators to justice. The government recently, with full honors, reinterred the bones of a World War II-era Lithuanian leader who had a very bad record with regard to Jews. In Lithuania, as elsewhere in Eastern Europe, a call has arisen for greater recognition of Stalin's crimes, and that call often seems bound up with an attempt to deny or diminish or distort Hitler's crimes. But I'm glad to say that people have stood up both inside and outside Lithuania to protest those incidents. This spring, Lithuanian nationalists marched down the main boulevard in Vilnius, and among the marchers were neo-Nazis. So what did the advocates of tolerance do? The director of the Jewish Museum invited the leaders of the march to the Tolerance Center for a tour, and they came. And there was also an alternative march, a tolerance march, complete with families and balloons and music. So I think we need to understand that in a country without a robust democratic tradition, change can be slow. Actually, come to think of it, even in a country with a robust democratic tradition, change can be slow. And I can't tell you whether, on balance, Lithuania is moving forward toward the tolerance that characterized this area for generations, or backward toward the prejudice that exploded into genocide 70 years ago. Maybe both. I'm looking forward to learning more when I visit Lithuania again in February, which is when my book is being translated into Lithuanian. So to show you the two tendencies, this graffiti says, first, up with a white Lithuania, but that's been crossed out, and in its place, someone has written, up with a world without racism. At the graduation ceremony at the Yiddish Institute, two tiny women in their 80s, former ghetto residents, led us in singing the partisan hymn composed in the Vilna ghetto in 1943. The song's refrain, Wir seien da, we are here, always used to strike me as sad, even pathetic, because so many of those who had sung that song in the ghetto had died, and so few had survived that we are not here would be more accurate. But as I stood up to sing, the song sounded different to me, because spinning through my head were the faces of brave people, flawed people, searching for a way forward out of the past. My Uncle Will, revealing his complex secret after 60 years of silence. Fanya and Rachel, the preservers of memory, guiding us students through the old Vilna ghetto. Irena Vesaita, rising out of a grim personal history to call for love and understanding. The two educators seeking to transform a country of bystanders into an active civil society. Ruta Prishita, the young woman at the Jewish Museum, traveling from village to pose tough moral questions. Stepanas, the haunted old man in Rakashkis, with his yearning to bear witness. And let's add those tolerance marchers from this spring too, even though they look a little weird. Now, to me, the song seems to ask all of us to connect ourselves to one another and to appeal to one another as fellow beings with the capacity for moral choice. Wir seien da, we are all here. Thank you. So I'm glad to hear from you. Yes?
Thank you. That was just absolutely wonderful. I've been to Lithuania 3 times and sung a lot of programs, as you know. So
Yes, this is Jerome Barry, who is a wonderful, wonderful singer, cantor, singing songs of Lithuania.
thank you so much. I was invited by the State Department and the embassy, American Embassy in Vilnius, to come and do some concerts and master classes, and I had the privilege of dealing with a lot of young Lithuanians, performing a program of classical music and ending with songs of the Vilna ghetto. And there were hundreds of these young youths from the academy in Vilnius, the service to bring to them an understanding of the culture that was, and with all the beautiful texts, a lot of them by Cassedy and great Yiddish poets, which, you know, the music is secondary to the great poetry in many of these songs, which these songs deal with the everyday experiences of life, a separation from your parents, searching for your wife, not going, and nobody's helping, and just the very mundane, pedestrian parts of Jewish life. To sort of bring to these young people the idea that this is something you should really think about, and we have to get to these young people. And there are a lot of people in the Lithuanian government, as we know, there's probably in my contact, many of them have come. We've got the minister, foreign minister, and speaker of the parliament, and all sorts of people. And they can say all sorts of things. But getting to these young people and telling them this is something you should know about, and not blaming them. It's not going to work. Not to be confrontational, but to let their conscience do it. And I think more people have to come and do this.
So you're calling on people to go to Lithuania and convey the history of Jewish culture that is part of their history.
And a number of candidates of my colleagues from the candidate assembly have done things there. It's very, very important for young Lithuanians to see this.
Other comments? Yes. In February in Lithuania, I'll be attending the Vilnius Book Festival, which draws a crowd of 60,000 people. And my Lithuanian publisher is arranging for some kind of event there. I'll be giving a program at the Tolerance Center. I showed you a picture from that part of the Jewish Museum. I will be meeting with students, as Mr. Barry also has, and I'll be going and speaking at regional museums, Jewish centers, and educational institutions in other cities, Kaunas, Šiauliai, Panevėžys, and back to Rokiškis, where my family's from. Yes, Peggy? Have I studied Lithuanian? I think I have a working vocabulary of about 30 words in Lithuanian so far. Lithuanian is a language most closely related to Sanskrit. It is a tonal language. It has many declensions and conjugations, and I have not taken it on. Yiddish is hard enough.
You've mentioned that your book is already or will be translated to Lithuanian?
My book is in the process of being translated. It's actually been a fascinating process for me because they sent me the translation as it currently exists, and I got some friends from the Lithuanian community of DC to sit down and go over it line by line, and this is increasing my Lithuanian vocabulary. And the translation, they said, is very good, but there were also, I would say, hundreds of things they found to change, errors. So in February is the publication date.
Are you planning during your being at the in Lithuania? Are you planning to also have this book presentation?
Yes, yeah, so the Lithuanian edition will be available as well as the English language edition in Lithuania, right? That's the whole idea, is to reach people in Lithuania with this story. And it's been a fascinating journey for me. You know, as I said, I started this kind of in a genealogical frame of mind, what had happened to my family. I wanted to see where my family had been. And then things opened out, and in the course of talking about my book, I've met so many wonderful non-Jewish Lithuanians who are hungry to explore this part of history and to think deeply, as I have been thinking, about the issues of responsibility and what we do with the past. I agree with Mr. Barry that simply rubbing people's noses in guilt is probably not as effective as maybe some other approaches, but nor do I think that the answer is to say, well, you weren't there, you're too young, therefore you bear no responsibility. I don't think that about myself as an American. I feel that the wrongdoing over the years in American history is part of my culture, and as a citizen, it's part of me, and I have a responsibility to explore those actions of the past and to situate myself toward them and to find ways to repair past wrongs. And I think that's true in Lithuania as well, and I hope my book will be part of doing that. Yes?
You mentioned that you were changed by the experience. In what ways were you changed?
I was brought up to think of myself as a kind of memorial candle about the Holocaust. Never forget, never forgive. And that memory, not my own memory, but was passed down to me, of the memory of murder and pain and death. And I think I kind of thought of Europe as a whole as enemy territory, and certainly Lithuania as enemy territory, where the door was kind of closed to my feeling that this was in some way my home. Because of what happened with my uncle and with Stepanas and the other people I began to meet, the door began to kind of creak open. And I found people on the other side of that door who were like me. And I no longer draw the circle as, we Jews versus those other people. It's been a very moving experience for me to find people of another culture who are just desperate to reach out to me and to engage in dialogue with me. I feel that that move, which took a long time to stop saying, okay, people either have to be jammed into this category or that category, has sort of opened up a whole new way of looking at a lot of things for me, and has really enriched my life and has made me sort of open to people and open to new kinds of understanding. So really writing this book, this whole journey has been a very deep experience for me that I feel very grateful for, and that's still ongoing. Other comments? So I'm happy to sign copies of the book or to just talk. I'm going to go back and sit next to the woman in the red sweater. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was terrific, and I hope you'll return, and we want to hear about your trip to Lithuania in February.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.